Hi everyone, I'm gonna present today the results of a study that we conducted at the University of Tours in France about the legacies and landscape influences on plant communities in urban wastelands. And I will start with the context in which this study takes place, which is the nature in the city, with two main influences of urbanization on ecological habitats that present opposite dynamics. Firstly, the fragmentation due to urbanization causes habitat destruction, and secondly, the extensive urbanization creates novel ecosystems, and among them we here study wastelands, which are habitats that emerge spontaneously in the city and that are different from classical urban green spaces. Urban wastelands are elements of the cities as they are abandoned space within urban areas. They can be found in multiple locations in the city, and they also can have multiple potential origins that are linked to urbanization processes. For example, you can see wastelands appearing from an industrial decline and an urbanization, or appearing from an agricultural decline and the urban sprawl in the city. So they have various trajectories that can be diversified with diversified previous land uses and evolutions that needs to be characterized in a fast changing environment. So our first question will be, what are the temporal trajectories of urban wastelands and their surroundings? Urban wastelands are also elements of nature in the city. The diversity of temporal trajectories and of urban landscapes can lead to a large variety of taxa, and the irregular or inexistent management practice leads to colonization of these spaces by spontaneous vegetation. This inexistent management practice also leads to also permits to see the direct influence of urban landscape on plant communities. But there is a lack of knowledge about the underlying mechanisms of plant assemblages, especially about the spatiotemporal dynamics that occur on these mechanisms. So our second question will be, which effects of legacies and landscape influences on plant communities in urban wastelands? Now about material and methods. Here is the conceptual model of the study, where we used 4 spatiotemporal scales with different descriptors to study the influence of spatial factors and temporal dynamics on plant communities, taxonomic and functional diversity. So I'm going to present you these spatial factors at local and at landscape scale, and past as well as current descriptors. First, the study sites that we use are the cities of Tours and Blois, where we studied 179 wastelands colonized by spontaneous vegetation, and for the current variable, we used at local scale wastelands area and ownership, and at landscape scale the distance to the city center. You can see on the map where the wastelands are located. As for temporal data, we we did a diagramic analysis by photointerpreting aerial photographs with a time step of 5 or 6 years over 40 years in order to see what wastelands were before their abandonment and what were their surroundings. So at local scale, we have for the past variables the former cover, and we can calculate the mean age of wastelands for the current variables. And at the landscape scale, we were able to photo interpret wastelands former surrounding land use as well as the current one. We then conducted an analysis on former cover and former surroundings of wastelands to analyze the temporal trajectories of wastelands and their neighborhoods, characterize five groups of evolution. Two of these groups are mostly wastelands that appeared in agricultural and natural surroundings, and you can see the evolution of the surrounding land uses. And the three groups are more related to housing and business surroundings, where you can see that the surroundings were individual or collective housing or business areas. To conduct the plant community data, uh, we recorded the abundance of all vascular plant species in 10 quadrats for each wasteland, and we identified species, taxonomic diversity, and functional ones with several indexes, the Shannon index and the Brackett's index for taxonomic diversity, and we selected several functional types that reveal a functional response to urban descriptors, and we used community weighted means on these types that are indigeneity, seed dispersal strategy, plant lifespan, GRIM competitive strategy, and ecological preferences. For statistical analysis, we conducted a model averaging procedure to understand the influence of the different descriptors for spatiotemporal scales on plant communities, taxonomic and functional diversity. And now for the results. To answer question 1 about wastelands evolution and trajectories, we can see that wastelands' former land cover description over time reveals the great agricultural decline and urban sprawl and its impact on wastelands apparition. But we can also see that diverse previous land covers were abandoned, leading to the appearance of wastelands. For example, you can see that in 1974 there were 44 current wastelands that were already vacant spaces, and 45 in 1978. 24 spaces were built up in 74 and 23 only in 78, so one built-up space was abandoned and turned into a wasteland between 74 and 78. During time, these other former covers other than agricultural show a constant and relatively low abandonment through time, and you can see that there is a majority of spaces that were agricultural. We can also see with these maps that the temporal trajectories of urban wastelands and their surroundings show a great diversity of urbanization processes with various former cover and in the different evolution groups. That shows that at landscape scale, wastelands apparition can occur on many types of land cover and surroundings, and that there is not a preferential land use that leads to the apparition of wastelands. So this urban mutability leads to various urban situations in which wastelands appear. For wasteland plants diversity, we can see that overall wastelands host more than 500 species on the 179 wastelands. That represents more than a quarter of a species regional pool. The average species richness is around 60 species, and among them there are mostly common species and some rare ones. But there are also more than 100 introduced species that were found, and among them around 20 were invasive. As for functional types, we can see that a quarter of species are annual and that there are high percentages of competitive species in wastelands compared to other studies on bigger cities, and the ecological preferences are relatively high for light and for pH. And now to answer the second question about the influence of legacies and landscape on wasteland plant diversity, we have various results, starting with their influence on taxonomic diversity, where we can see that the evolution group C and E related to housing as a negative influence on Shannon diversity index, as well as the percentage of agricultural areas in the surroundings, the area of the wastelands, their age, and a private ownership. On the other hand, the distance to the city center has a positive influence on Shannon Diversity Index. For the composition dissimilarity between wastelands, we can see that the age and the percentage of collective housing in the surroundings has a positive influence on dissimilarity, and the agricultural form of cover tends to have a negative influence. For functional diversity with community weighted means, we can see that annual species are positively influenced by the percentage of business areas in the surroundings and negatively influenced by the age and the distance to the city center. We can find more exotic species in wastelands that are linked to evolution group C, and a negative influence of the area on exotic species. As for green strategies, we can see that in wastelands that are large and surrounded by agricultural areas, we have more competitive species and less in wastelands that are surrounded by business areas. As for ruderal species, there is a negative influence of age and the percentage of agricultural areas in the surroundings. And functional types related to dispersal vectors also present significant responses to legacies and landscapes, with the presence of business areas in the surroundings which have a positive effect on anemochoric species, whereas wastelands mean age and housing farmer cover has a negative effect. And we can see that zoochoric species presents opposite influences as compared to anemochory. Finally, for ecological preferences, nitrophilous species communities are more represented in evolution group E, which is the group with collective and individual housing, and we also observe a positive influence of agricultural areas in the surrounding. And thermophilous and acidophilous species are positively influenced by the percentage of business areas in the surrounding. Then, to understand this cross influence, we compared the relative influence of legacies versus current variables and landscape versus local effects on plant communities. And the results show that the urban characteristics influence plant communities' diversity at both past and current or local as well as landscape scale. This relative influence helps to understand which groups of variable are the more substantial. We can see that the local scaled variables tend to present a relatively similar importance, and that there is a tendency for current variables to have a higher relative importance of influence than past ones. And these main differences can be seen for landscape scaled variables. So the past urban characteristics are as influenced as the current ones for plant communities. These results lead to several perspectives in conclusion. First, that wasteland plant communities are dependent of urban dynamics through time and space. We can see that there is a diversity of composition and functional types, showing that wastelands reveal a great complexity of habitats, and that the land cover heterogeneity at local and landscape scales also implies plant communities diversity, but it's not sufficient to characterize it. We also saw that less modifications of wastelands or their surroundings may favor ecological succession, revealing a high competitiveness and stress tolerance, and a lower proportion of annual and ruderal species. The diversity of environmental conditions leading to wastelands appearance shows that urban mutability and the resulting wastelands turnover can benefit urban biodiversity, and that it's crucial to consider both spatial and temporal variables to understand wastelands plant communities. Indeed, wastelands are a combination of conditions, including the legacies, which needs to be considered in urban planning issues that is also operating at a multiple scale. Therefore, ecologists and urban planners should work together to point out the multiplicity and diversity of urban green spaces which wastelands offer, especially in a rapidly urbanizing world. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you in live discussion if you have any questions.